Hello, everyone. My name is Jen Lansford, and I am the director of the Center for Child and Family Policy here at Duke University. I would like to welcome you tonight and thank you for attending the Sulzberger Distinguished Lecture. The Center for Child and Family Policy sponsors the Sulzberger Distinguished Lecture series to stimulate the intellectual community, not only for its own faculty, research scientists, and staff, but also for Duke University broadly, Durham, and now, thanks to our virtual reach, people across the United States. The Sulzberger series brings prominent researchers, policymakers, and other leading thinkers in child and family policy to campus to share their experiences on topics and issues impacting child and family well-being. These lectures are made possible through an endowment from the Arthur Sulzberger family, and I would like to thank Cynthia Sulzberger and Stephen Green in particular for their support. They're tuning in via Zoom tonight. So speaking of technology, now is a great time to remind you to please silence your phones. So thank you very much. Tonight, we are humbled to have Dr. Dudley Flood as our guest speaker. He will be in conversation with Dr. Keisha Bentley-Edwards for about an hour, after which we will open up for questions and answers from the audience. It's my pleasure now to introduce Dr. Keisha Bentley-Edwards, Associate Professor and Associate Director of Research at the Samuel DuBois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke University. Thank you so much, Dr. Bentley-Edwards, for your knowledge and leadership in guiding this conversation.
Thank you. So I really jumped at this opportunity to be a part of this conversation with Dr. Flood. I will give you a little background of an introduction before we get started. So Dr. Flood joined the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction in 1970, tasked with helping every community in the state desegregate, and that's a key word that you'll hear a lot, schools by meeting with elected officials, community activists, and parents. His work in Hyde County, where Black parents had been boycotting the schools for an entire school year, not used to paper anymore. I'm used to being virtual. In protest of a plan that closed 2 historically Black schools, is illustrative of the challenges he faced in his successful collaborative strategy for change. He has received more than 350 awards for civic service, including the state's highest civilian honor, the North Carolina Award, in the category of public service. He has also been presented the Order of the Longleaf Pine Award by 3 different governors, Governor Hunt, Martin, and Easley. And the Dudley Flood Center for Educational Equity and Opportunity is named in his honor. Dr. Flood earned his bachelor's degree from North Carolina Central University, right here in town, a master's degree in educational administration from East Carolina University, and his doctorate degree in educational administration from Duke. He's been honored with the Outstanding Alumni Award from North Carolina Central University and East Carolina University. Welcome to Duke, Dr. Flood.
My pleasure, my honor.
So before we start the conversation, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to context and a little bit of the history. And so oftentimes when we think about desegregation, the focus is on Brown versus Board of Education. And oftentimes there's this perception that once this court ruling happened, that the doors of all the schools were just open wide and say, come on, Black people. That's not exactly how it happened. And that was 1954. And then in 1955, the Supreme Court said, let's clarify a few things. And in Brown 2, that desegregation had to occur with all deliberate speed, still pretty vague, but obviously different definitions of speed. And so it acknowledged that there was local control and that it was complex and that implementation needed to be thoughtful. But obviously this was a slow pace. So we're talking 1954. The Little Rock 9 integrated schools in Little Rock Central High School in I was about to say Ohio, in Central High School in Arkansas in 1957. But that was after the governor blocked their entrance with the National Guard. after these kids had to go through belligerent mobs and President Eisenhower intervened. Here in North Carolina, Dorothy Counts Scoggins was the first Black student to go to a predominantly white school in North Carolina at Harding's High School in Charlotte. Just to be very clear, we are all talking about living people. So a lot of times people make this idea of it happened so very long ago. We just saw her 3 weeks ago at the Color of Education, and she's still spry. And in 1958, the Supreme Court says, hey, just because you have violence occurring in local communities, it doesn't mean that you can't still desegregate. It's still a priority. So this comes up to all the different things that were going on to push up against school desegregation. So you had white school districts or school districts who were saying, we're just gonna shut all the schools down. You had those who said, we'll do it, but we're gonna keep the Black kids on one floor, white kids. We know that Ruby Bridges in 1960 came in and all the white parents pulled their children out of the school. And you had these freedom of choice plans that really were not free. So now we get to 1968. And in 1968, which was a year of a lot of protests across the country, you had summer of riots that were going on because there was still police brutality, there was still segregation, and all this was happening. And then it finally touched the rural county here in North Carolina, Hyde County. And so in 1968, the school board said, okay, we're gonna desegregate, but we're gonna close down the Black schools, but we're gonna let you come to our school. In their minds, they were offering a compromise for segregation, but the Black people did not see it that way. The Black people in Hyde County boycotted the entire school year. Over 90% of students stood out of school from kindergarten all the way through high school for a full year and protested daily. And then that's where you come in this time frame. And so that's where I want to talk to you. What got you involved with Hyde County and the negotiations that occurred for desegregation?
Thank you for the question. Thank you for allowing me to share this time with you. Prior to that time, I was principal in a school, and we had had a fair amount of success in bringing our people together. And the state superintendent, who was Craig Phillips, had just come on board and recognized what had not heretofore been acknowledged, because there had been a major effort to circumvent the desegregation of public schools. And it had been endorsed by the highest levels of government, so much so that there had been a law passed saying that if you were to choose to go to another school in which your race was in the minority, they would provide transportation. That was the incentive. And if you chose as a school district to close school, you had the option to do that. Now that was less talked about, but it was clear that that was an option, and there were those who attempted to exercise that option. But in 1968, when the Hyde County Board of Education, in its effort to appease its community and at the same time to follow the law, determined that it would close 2 schools, one in Englehart, which is in the eastern part of the county, and one in Mattamuskeet, which is in the virtually the center of the county, which were Black schools. And I'm sorry, in Swan Quarter. Mattamuskeet was where there was a white school. Now the idea there had been that if we just close these 2 schools and everybody would have gone to the same school, we would have met the challenge. Legally, you would have. Societally, you would not have, because there were considerations that were not thought about in that decision. The first was that the Black school was the center of the Black community. It was much more than just a place to go and be educated. It was the absolute center. It was the heartbeat of the community. It was the one place that black people assembled for whatever reason they needed to. It was the one place that they felt ownership because the distinction had been so great that nobody in the hierarchy paid any attention really to what went on in the black school. So it was totally autonomous. Although it had no money with which to be autonomous, it was totally autonomous. So that it could have things like a playground, it could have things like a recreation center, it could have plays for public shows, for athletic endeavor, and so on and so forth. And the community was not willing to give up those options, which they had enjoyed. They were very aware that the probability was, first of all, when you attend a school diligently, it is your school in your mind. When you attend a school which you are drafted to go to, it's their school. Whatever your mine and theirs means to you is a great distinction in the minds of most people. And I don't think people realize the distinction and how important it was that when I go to my school, however I define that, I have a fidelity to that school much different than even if I go to the very nicest place on earth, it's not mine. And so one of the needs was to make this school everybody's school, whichever school you're going to, has to be everybody's school. Now that is true in any institution, but it's more true in school because school is the only entity we have in America that belongs to all the people. The reason for public education is not just for you. It's an eleemosynary concept, as much as your highway is, as much as your, it's there for all the people. And I didn't go to school for me, although I thought I was. I went to school for you. That's why I'm here. I'm here because school gave me something to pass on to you and to others. And without having that as a consideration, we were wasting a tremendous amount of talent by having people isolated away from what might have been an improved experience for them. Now, if we had thought through this rather than felt through this, that might have been the conclusion we had reached. But unfortunately, when change comes, we don't do a lot of thinking. We do a lot of reacting, a lot of feeling. And in most of the instances, and by the way, Hyde County was known more than other environments because it was the first of the schools in North Carolina, and the first notably so that a whole year boycott was prevailed in the country. There were other episodes when people stayed out a few days, some even a month maybe, but not a year. It was my privilege, I'm going to categorize it as a privilege, to have spoken at their graduation that year, to which 7 students attended. We went right on as though we had a lot of people, but 7 students attended the graduation. The others didn't come. They couldn't come because they didn't graduate. Well, in that setting, the challenge was threefold. And keep in mind, while the law had been explicit to those of us who studied the law, it was not explicit to the populace, because the word of the ruling coming from the Supreme Court, the initial Brown 1 in 1954 simply said, we have determined that dual schools are inherently unconstitutional.
Yep.
Inherently unconstitutional. And most of us my age said, my goodness, it took you this long to figure that out. I'd been knowing that all my life, and at that time, I was a senior over at North Carolina Central. But having graduated that year and gone into teaching, I also became an athletic coach. And the first manifestation of Brown 1 was that if you were of a bent to elect to have your student apply to another school, if you had the courage to do that and you had the forethought to support that decision, you could do so and you would not be rejected. So the burden was on a very select group of people. That was the group of people who had the courage, who had the stamina, who had the wherewithal to support their child in going to another school. Transportation was provided, but that notwithstanding, it took a great deal more courage than just the fact that you have a way of getting there. And second element of that was that societal implication, as I mentioned earlier, was you're going to somebody else's school. All the artifacts suggested that it really wasn't your school. And that was the second leg of the challenge. And third was somebody's mother graduated from this school and somebody's grandmother graduated from this school. And no matter how poor it is, the legacy factor is such that I don't want my kid not to go to this school because this is where I finished and this is where I graduated. So in approaching that, you had to approach it from various aspects. You couldn't just follow the law and say something bad's going to happen to you if you don't do this, although something bad was going to happen to you if you didn't do this, because you're going to lose your federal funding. And certainly as an educator, I didn't want to see anybody lose a penny because didn't have enough money to start with, and here you are going to lose some of that. So our job then became to help with those three aspects. How do you bring a community along with an understanding of what is critical about this? And the second was to be a liaison between the federal government and the particular school units, because the federal government was following just one thing, and that is what is written, had no knowledge of the culture, in some cases no interest in the culture, certainly that which deviated from the norm. And so the service liaison helping one of those understand the other was something of a challenge. And then the challenge of having the students themselves move into that environment in a successful manner and take their rightful place was the third leg of that challenge. So Hyde County was the first, certainly not the only, where that challenge existed, because it says we had 152 school districts in the state of North Carolina at the time. There was not one single one of them didn't have a similar challenge, but not to the degree. The degree being that in Hyde County, the African-American population was totally dependent on the school. They have no other access to anything that at which they could gather, except the faith-based community, of course, had churches, but there are a few things you can't do in church that you could do in school, and that some of our young people wanted quite badly to do. Things like major reading and playing some athletics and that sort of thing. Churches don't do a good job at that. So that was the heel of the challenge. I'll just give you the background and I'll entertain whatever questions you have relative to that, but that's what got us into, that's to answer your question, that's what brought me in. I was drafted in by the state superintendent, who had recognized that I think in our school we had demonstrated the possibility that human beings who were different from each other could live together in a fashion that was profitable to each of those, not to the value of one over the other, but profitable for each of those. And he, having seen that, invited me along with another friend, Gene Cosby, who was my colleague, to come and see if we could spread that around the state. And we had the pleasure of doing that for the next several years.
So that's very vivid, and especially thinking about the schools. This is where the pillars of society were. The teaching profession is one of the few professions in the segregated South where a Black person could find a job, right? That was not in the service industry where you can consistently. So it wasn't just that they were going to close the schools, they were going to fire all the teachers, all the administrators, and the staff. It's, to emphasize how it was going to affect the small community. And with the students, one of the things that I really appreciated about the way that, there's two things. So just as Dr. Flood talked about the school being the center of the community, these protests also triggered other protests in the community where in the fishing and the plant industry and all these other factories, folks said, you know what, we don't have to be settle for things that are subpar. So it triggered a whole bunch of things. So just to be clear that we're talking about the schools, but we're talking about the whole community, that a community that was not extremely active prior to that, that suddenly said, you know what, now is the time, because it's not just about us. We're talking about where our grandparents went to school, but also we're thinking about the future. So we have small children, you know, thinking about the future and what they want to leave for the next generation. And that gets me to, even when you were talking about finding this balance. So with the schools, now the kids were being arrested, both in local jails and being sent out. The KKK was there, the Panthers were there, all of the major civil rights organizations were there. So with all these people with differing interests, how were you received when you got there? Were people trusting you? Were people not trusting you? Were they like, who's this man? Like, how did they respond?
When you arrive, first thing you must realize is that you don't change anything until you can change the narrative for the populace. So if you're going in and hoping that the law will work, hoping that some strategy will work, that is short of changing the narrative, and that's an educational process. That is why it was necessary for educators to do this. I don't know that anybody else could have done it. Social workers maybe, but nobody else could have done it except educators and social workers. So we weren't so bright. We were just in the right place at the right time. And so the first thing you had to ensure was that you know that I'm not your enemy. I don't come here as your enemy. I'm here by invitation primarily, whether it's yours or somebody's invited us to be here. And our purpose here is to ensure that we are able to talk among ourselves to come to a conclusion. So we begin every conversation with some parameters. And the parameters were very simple ones. When we shall have reached the conclusion here, it will not be that we shall have voted. It will be that we will have reached a consensus. Voting has some good effects, but it has a tendency to polarize people. Somebody wins and somebody loses. And I wouldn't expect there to be a whole lot of harmony between you if you had lost and somebody had won. So we weren't interested in a win-loss situation. We're interested in there being a consensus. Now, we define consensus. Consensus doesn't mean everybody agreed to everything. It means that whatever we have concluded here is amenable, you're amenable to it. So we established three guidelines, three parameters. The first parameter is that whatever we conclude here must be educationally sound. I will not be able to sign off something as a representative of the state of North Carolina that we determined to be educationally sound. And I need you to trust our never leading you away from understanding what is educational sound and what isn't. The second thing is that it must be mutually agreeable. Not everybody knowing the same thing, it must be mutually agreeable. And the third thing is that it must be terminable, doable. That is, we have to look at what will it look like when it shall have been done. Because if you're going to inspire somebody to do something, they have to know what the conclusion will look like. It's not good enough to say this will be different. It has to be different and better. So if you cannot demonstrate in what ways it will be better, then you have a much more difficult time in selling that difference is just good because it's different. So you begin by determining three things we'd ask. When we're looking at any aspect of this program, let's ask ourselves, what, so what, now what? Now, when we clarify the what, a lot of times the so what manifests itself. There is none. It doesn't matter. This doesn't hurt. This doesn't help. But you don't say that. You let people discover, and that was particularly true with the young people, the kids, because it was not unusual for a kid to come in and say, "Well, they called me a name. So what? Does that make you that? If they call you that 10 times, does that make you that?" So if you can get through the so what, then you can get to the now what. Now we need to create an atmosphere in which people don't feel necessary to categorize each other. And there are some things you need to know as to how you get there. And so now we're ready to teach. How do people become civil? How do people learn to interact? How do people recognize what we mean by equal status relationships? That's what we're looking for as an outcome here, equal status relationship. That simply means that your word is no greater than his word than her word. Each of you has equal status when we're in this discussion. So there are no dumb comments and no silly comments, and the same thing, there are no real bright comments. Everybody in here is on a lateral playing field, and it takes a little bit to reach that point, because what you expect in the outset is adversariality. Anytime you go into any session that is there for change, expect there to be adversariality. Not necessarily hostility, but there are some people who came to make sure this doesn't come out well. I wish I could give you better notice than that. Whether it's you or whether it's somewhere else, there's somebody there who hopes this doesn't come out well. Except, of course, this meeting tonight. Everybody hopes this comes out well. But all the other meetings I've been in, which have been a few thousand, there was somebody there who came to see how poorly this was organized, how poorly it was structured, how little the people knew who were in charge and so forth. Now, they're not going to tell you that. They show you that. They show you that. So if your skin isn't thick enough to overcome that, don't get into that business. Stay away from it. It's not about you. It's about the outcome. The outcome is we're here to achieve something. So if my favorite artist is a man named Chris Christopherson. And he wrote a song that said, everybody's got to have somebody to look down on. Fools they can feel better than in any time they please. Someone doing something dirty, decent folks can frown on. So if you can't find nobody else, just help yourself to me. Well, that was Gene and me. If you can't find anybody else to denigrate, help yourself to us, because we can handle this. How do we handle it? Because we already knew who we were when we went in a room. We didn't need a definition to come from anybody else. We already knew that. We knew we had studied what we were about. We knew we had collaborated what we were about. We knew we had developed a scheme for creating the atmosphere that we needed to create in the room. And we were not angry with anybody there. Neither of us ever in our life hated any other human being. If you don't have that credential, stay away from this kind of work. If you got a dozen or so folk you can't stand, please don't go into this kind of work, because it'll manifest itself. They don't have to be very bright to figure that out. And they will not respect you back if you don't give them respect. So once you develop those parameters, then you were able, without having to attack somebody, well, we ought to just go back to, ma'am, that wouldn't be legal. See, because we'd already established parameters, said we can't recommend something that's illegal here. So we don't have to say that's a silly question. We said, would that follow the law? Then when we say this has to be educationally sound, and when you begin to do things that our experience has shown us is not in the best interest of youth, we just ask you, does that sound like it's educationally sound to you? When you start cutting out this and cutting out that and cutting out the other, which we're beginning to see a little of now, is that educationally sound? And we have them talk about it. We don't necessarily try to give them the answer. We do have an opinion about that. If you'd like to have my opinion, I'd like to share it with you. But you didn't use power. Power is in knowledge. Power is in having the knowledge that you can pass on to somebody so they can make a proper decision. You can't just take your decision, and you can't do that. I mean, not in instances that are sensitive like this. So the process always had to be an invitation. I'll give you one more example of what was useful for us. And this was something that we discovered in Hyde County. We were on the way to Hyde County, and I stopped in Greenville, as you would do, and we were headed for a meeting in which we had expected there to be a plethora of people who were not a part of the county. They had made notice that we'll be a gathering here tonight, and we will have Klansmen here, and we'll have Black Panthers here, and we'll have people from the rights of white people, and we'll have people from the NAACP. And they had one very fascinating school that that calls themselves the SOS. That they said it would save our school, but I found out it was skin our superintendent. At least that's what it turned out to be. But here you are, knowing to begin with, they're not on one accord. They didn't come here to be on one accord. So I was fortunate. I saw this little rubber ball on a bat. You know, seen these little balls on a paddle. And it turned out that it had a little ream around it, and one side of it was green and one side was red. So when we arrived, I said, before we begin this discussion, I want to ask you a question. And I held this ball up and I said, what color is this ball? They said, green. I said, oh no, it's red. It's green. I said, it's red. We quarreled a few minutes and I turned the ball around. Oh, they said, on your side, it's green. Oh, yes. On your side, it's red. I understand that, and it will always be red on your side. But what if you were to come around and see how it looks to me? And what if I were to come around and see how it looks to you? Might not we have a better chance of coming to a consensus about what actually is this ball? As simple as that sounds to you, it begins to change the narrative. It begins right away to change the narrative. You begin to realize there's more sides to this thing than mine. And I haven't asked you to acquiesce your side. I've simply asked you to realize there is another side. And now you're in position to learn. You're in position to understand that there's more to this than just what you think you have at stake. So we were able then to have a reasonably good open conversation without shouting and using poor language and that sort of thing. But it begins with changing the narrative, because if you come in thinking one thing and you continue to think that thing, you will defend what you thought. And so long as you're committed to defending that, it is unlikely that you're going to change much of your narrative. But when you can open the floor where you will hear other people's perceptions, and then without animosity, share yours, you have a whole lot better chance of moving forward. Now, I wish I could tell you that happened in one night. It took a year. It took a year of repetition.
No, a year makes sense.
But you got to start somewhere. I was just telling you.
No,
this is
no, you've got to, not only you have to start somewhere, but you got to build the trust.
It takes that long. It
Yeah.
takes that long to see that, you know, we're here for the same purpose as your children. And I can't tell you how many times I've said the only people have a right to be at school in North Carolina are children. The state says the state must accommodate the children. People have the right to the privilege of education, and it is the duty of the state to guard and maintain that right. They're not talking about me. They're talking about the students. As long as I was a teacher, I was there by privilege. I had no right to be there. When I was a principal, I had no right to be there. I was there by responsibility. But the children have a right to be there. And we have the responsibility to guard and maintain that right. And as many times as I need to say that, I don't mind. But I will have you to know one thing. This got in our Constitution in 1971. Prior to 1971, we had no such thing in our North Carolina Constitution. That was established in 1971. Prior to that, it was not clear in North Carolina that you had any specific right different from whatever the General Assembly would propose on a given year that you could have. And if we went deep enough into history, you would understand that was extremely, extremely limited for people of color, extremely so. So much so that gentleman who ran for governor, I don't call a lot of names. You can research this, because I don't give a lot of attention to people who don't need my attention. But the gentleman who ran for governor in 1901 ran on the premise of three things. Number one, that if we were to disenfranchise people of color of education, we would be able to maintain a better society. And the manner in which we would do that is this. Number one, when appropriations are given, the per pupil appropriation, which is still the way we allocate money, by the way, poor way, but still what we do. Propriation for each white child will be $501. For each black child, $212. That was the start. So the allocation formula already determined that we're talking second class here, and we're talking maintaining second class. The second is that in order to vote, you will take a literacy test. Literacy test is whatever the person sitting at the desk where you go to register says it is. So he may ask you how many gumballs in this bean jar. He might ask you to give me the third article of the United States Constitution verbatim. Whatever it was that kept you from voting was what was used to keep you from voting. And the third thing was they passed a law having something called a poll tax. A poll tax. That means in order to vote, you had to pay property tax. Well, if you didn't own any property, you didn't pay any property tax. And there weren't a plethora of African Americans who owned a whole lot of property in Hyde County, and so they weren't paying poll tax, so they couldn't vote. All these things were undergirding. Now, the students who boycotted didn't know all this, but their parents knew all this. They may not have been able to articulate it in that fashion, but they knew it. And that reaches a point where at some point you say, enough of this, enough of this, whatever it takes, this is as far as this is going. So that stimulated it.
No, absolutely. So there's one thing, well, there's several things. You sparked a lot of questions in my head. When you were talking about it taking a year to get this process going and the talks going, one of the big issues, as you said, is that when they made the decision to close these schools, no Black people were involved. It was a closed session. Even poor white people were not involved. No. It was just a pure, this is our decision, we make it, you're gonna have to accept it. It actually was not a financially good decision. It was not a convenient decision, but it maintained power. And a big part of this, why the protest happened, was that folks were making decisions unilaterally. And what I really appreciated, what you talked about, was bringing people in the room and making everyone realize that they had a vested interest in the success of all the children in the community. And so you were able to bridge the Black community and the white community together, because a lot of the Black parents weren't they weren't in a hurry to send their kids to white schools, because you have to, as I talked about, they saw what was happening in the news with Ruby Bridges. They saw what was happening in Charlotte and all these other places, and they'd already seen their kids protesting, and they didn't want to send them into a place where they would be treated as less than. So a big part of what you did was you had everyone in the room, including the students, being a part of the decision-making, from everything, like you said, to make sure that it was still academically sound, but that it went down to everything, to student government, to the homecoming, to the trophy cases, what celebrations we were going to honor, and even the inclusion, and this will be familiar to you given what we're going through right now, of Black history curriculum. So these arguments are not new in North Carolina, but these kids were ahead of the game in the high school level, because we were still fighting in the college level to get Black history and Black studies in the curriculum and majors, and here at Duke University at that time. But the high school kids also were able to negotiate for Black history to be an option. And even then, you were able to recognize that it was educationally sound.
Yes. One of the strategies was to equip the young people in how to negotiate their needs. And since this is 50 years ago, I can now tell you some of the specifics of how we did that. First of all, we helped them change their language. They would write a list of demands And we would say to them, that's not how this works. The minute you demand something of a person in authority, you're going to get a good no right then. Even if it's a good idea, it's just not going to happen. So we help them to understand the paradigm of how change really takes place. The first thing that you have to do in having change to take place is have a concern. Have a concern. Define your concern. What is your concern? And the concern ought to have some validity to it. It's not just that my idiosyncratic wish is that I'm concerned that, that's why I use the what, so what, now what. So what is your concern? Then following the concern, if you don't get a proper response, you issue some requests. Requests are much more likely to be acted upon if you can do something at the request level. And you need to word those in a way that doesn't generate hostility, doesn't generate opposition. So you have to have some language as to how to do that. We didn't expect young people, 10th, 11th grade, to have that language, so we were able to give it to them. If it goes beyond that, then it's going to become demands. When you reach demands, let me assure you what you're going to have. You're going to have polarization. The minute you get to the demand stage, you're going to have some people against, some people for, and some in each of these camps won't even know what the issue was. They just know I'm on your side because you don't have a choice. Whose side are you on? Even if you had that here, as sophisticated as you are, if you had a major issue on your campus, you're going to be expected to take a side. Whose side? You're either for me or you're against me. And so if you get to that stage where you're talking about demands, then you're going to have a difficult time moving much beyond that in a positive way. Generally, after demands, what you run into is some unpleasant experiences. Not always a boycott, not always walk out, but some unpleasant experiences, and we call it conflict. And we would have them to understand what we're here to help you not have to have a major conflict. That's really an unpleasant situation. But here's the interesting thing about conflict. Once you read conflict, once you read the point of conflict, people are more inclined to think back on how do we reconcile. Now, I'm not advocating conflict because my job is to keep that from happening. And we were reasonably successful in most cases in doing so. But we had to start by helping all the people involved to understand this is where you're headed here. And that doesn't generally help, because when you reach conflict, the result of that is change, and you're right back where you started. Because as soon as you make the change, you run that cycle over and over and over again. So what we want to do is we want to deal with this thing up here at the level of concern. And we didn't simplify the concern. We helped you to understand the nature of the concern and the legitimacy of the concern and how you report that concern to somebody who can do something about it. And again, please keep this in this room, but we'd say to the kids, they'd show us, well, we've got 10 concerns, and you want to take those to the board? Take 15. You're not going to get all of them. Give them 5 to throw away. Now, if you all have a demonstration here, don't try that. But it works. Nobody's going to give you all of what you ask for. Nobody's going to give you all of what you ask for. So if you were really serious about, and they wouldn't be trivial, they would be things that you could concede. So we can back gracefully away from, okay, then when we talk to the other side, that being the board or whomever was the decider, we would say to them, here are 3 considerations you need to make when you see these concerns. The first ones is those that you can approve. You approve them publicly and immediately. And let it be known that we approve them because they were brought to us by responsible citizens. Secondly, there'll be some that you cannot approve right now because there are circumstances that prevail. let them know these are things we cannot do right now, because if these were to be modified, we may be able to do them in an appropriate time at an appropriate place. You got two things on your side. Now you only got one. There's some things we can't do, what we're not going to do. But the language is better. We can't do this, but tell me why. Give me the reason that you can't do this. People are generally pretty accepting when they've gotten a lot of what they wanted, and they realize coming in, because we'd seen that they really not going to get everything you're going in and ask for. You're going to ask for cutting the school day down to 3 hours. You're not going to get that. But put it in there. Put it in your list.
Put it in there as a throwaway.
Yeah, you got something for them to say, no, we're not going to do that. And they feel all right about having still been in charge. People who are elected to be in charge want to be in charge. That's why they were elected. So they're not going to let you tell them how to run the school. But if you carry them in an appropriate way, legitimate considerations, and you're able to defend those by saying, this is how this can be made to work, this is how it can happen, this is what you can bank on us to do in response to it. Though it may take a year sometimes, it most of the time did not take a year. I don't remember more than 2 or 3 instances in which we were unable to rectify whatever the specific was within a few weeks, using generally that same common paradigm.
Well, because a lot of places were afraid of becoming another Hyde County, right?
Oh, listen, Hyde County, as I said before, the uniqueness of Hyde County was simply that it number one, was a majority black county, population-wise. And there had been no blacks elected to anything, and nobody on the school board, nobody on the city town council, no black had held any office in Hyde County in 1971. As a matter of fact, 1980, they still hadn't. And I haven't been there lately, so I don't know, but I don't think there are a plethora of blacks holding elected positions, and even now, some of you may be from there and near there. We still have counties in North Carolina where African Americans have no power. We still have that. And it's less noticeable because they own things and they're in charge of what they own. They do things that are not dependent on public policy. But we still have most of them of east of I-95, most of them that fall in that. And reason I keep saying people of color, because we have Native Americans in North Carolina who are in the very same circumstances. I'm telling you, the absolute very same circumstance. The difference is they were under the radar for a long while, but they weren't under the radar to us, because our job was the whole state. And Robeson County had 6 school districts within the county, 1 county school and 5 municipal school districts, each of which was different. And each had its reason for wanting to be different. And so there was nobody who was an exemption to this, but they didn't obviously get the first. There's only one first. So if you're first, you're going to get that, you're going to get that Blair. If I were to categorize, which I never will, which was the most difficult situation, it would not have been Hyde County. It would not have been the most difficult situation we worked with.
So this is something that I've heard you make a distinction about, and I think it's pretty relevant. The difference between desegregation and integration.
Thank you. Desegregation is a legal process. The law required that. When the Supreme Court came back with round 2, it said we must move with deliberate speed to eliminate the dual school system and to remove the vestiges thereof. Now, eliminating the dual school system is desegregation. Removing the vestiges there are is integration. We have done desegregation. We are nowhere close to having done integration, nowhere close. There are instances in which we recapitulated to a point that we are less integrated now than we were when we were doing our work 50 years ago. And that's not by happenstance. That's not by happenstance. There were people who never accepted the notion that integration was a legitimate process. And that's why I mentioned to you earlier, unless you change the narrative, you're not going to have any permanent change until we change the narrative. So what you have to work at now is not just following the law, although you must, But you have to go a little deeper than that. You have to understand how people come to think what they think, feel what they feel, operate on it, and how do you adapt your thinking so that you can intervene in that thinking. And that's a whole process of integration. Keep in mind, I only worked with desegregation for 5 years. I've been working with integration for the last 45 years. And I will do that the rest of my natural life because we will not have completed it. But I'm only 90 years old. But, you know, the first half of my life I've enjoyed it. But the second half, the next 90, I'm going to be working on integration everywhere I go. So I invite you to do so because it may take that long. I hope it won't. But it may take that long for everybody to understand that different does not mean deficient. It means different. It doesn't mean deficient. So long as we believe if you're not just like me, there's something wrong with you, we're not integrated. When you accept a human being's personhood and you respect that person's personhood, you don't have to be just like them. I mentioned Gene. I would never speak anywhere without referring to Gene Cosby. Gene was a white boy from the mountains. I'm a black boy from eastern North Carolina. And we loved each other as much as two men can love each other and still be men. So all you had to do was to see the possibility. You didn't have to hear anything but just see us together. And you knew, and when somebody would say, that's you and Gene, that's well, how many do you have to see? How many do you have to see to know it can be done? How many? And so if you are going to do this work, you have to be the change you want to see. You have to become the change you want to see. Nobody's going to pay attention to you when you're saying one thing and acting in a different way. So if you can't manifest that you respect every human being and that you're not concerned about differences they have with yours, you don't have to acquiesce to those differences. You have to accept that is who you are. I was sharing with my colleagues on Monday, not Monday, but last week I was riding with a friend who was driving and somebody cut across, you know how somebody will take your lane. And she said, look what they did to me. And I said, they didn't do that to you. They just did that. That's who they are. That didn't have anything to do with you. That's the so what. Now, am I supposed to acquiesce me and become them and take something and throw at them or shoot at them or cuss at them? No. I'm going to keep on being me. I'm going to keep on manifesting that I understand you're different. You can't wait to get where you're going. I'll usually leave 10 minutes earlier than I need to. I don't have to cut across you in an abject way. So if you don't take some onus in modeling what you believe, you will have no consequence. You will have no serious consequence. You may feel better, but you won't have any consequence. But if you model, if you demonstrate, when I go into a school and I see the lunchroom, and over this table there are African Americans, and over this table there are Caucasian Americans, and over this table there are Native Americans, and so on and so forth. If I just see that once, it doesn't concern me. But if I see that repeatedly, every time I go in there, I'm wondering, is there nobody here who feels comfortable at that table? And if not, why? Is there nobody here that feels comfortable interacting with someone who is different? If not, why? There's something missing in the fabric of this school. And I find that to be true wherever I am. Doesn't have to be in school. Right now, I'm working with some churches. I don't call it work because it's not work for me. You know, it's what I do. And the first thing I tell them is that we're just having a lecture here about diversity in your church, but next time I come, we got to have some real diversity. Do you know that the most segregated institution in America is the church? Most segregated. not only are we segregated along lines of race, but we're segregated along the lines of which church you belong to. And those are people who believe in heaven. I don't know what you believe in, but I don't believe there are 10 or 12 heavens. I don't believe there's a Catholic heaven and a Presbyterian heaven and a black heaven and a white heaven. I don't believe that. Maybe, but I don't believe that. So how in the world do you prepare yourself to go to that place that you're always talking about when you're going to get up there and you won't know where you're supposed to be? When you, oh, it's just one. Logic says to me that every aspect of your life is based on your respect for other human beings. Every aspect of it. You couldn't be a teacher if you didn't respect all the students. You could be standing in front of the classroom, but you couldn't be a teacher. A teacher is somebody who gets results. And students will know right away whether you have respect for them. So what we had to teach young people there was how do you gain respect? Let me give you one personal reference. When I came to Duke in 1978 to work on my doctorate, I was the only African American that I saw in any class that I had in 2 years. I knew that when I came. So the first thing I did was I got me a set of books and put them under my arm. And I went to every one of my professors. First, I asked people, who are the professors nobody wants to go to here? And they gave me that list, rolled in all their classes, because they're going to have small class size. That puts me a little ahead of the game. And then I would take my books and I would go to each one of them. And I'd say, Dr. Petty, sir, my name is Dudley Flood. And I wonder if you'd be willing to tell me, what is it you expect from us, your better students? He would go, what'd you say? What is it you expect from us, your better students? Keep this in this room. I got preferential treatment from every teacher I had. Every teacher I had here. If they didn't have but 10 questions they asked, I got 3 of them. And that's the truth. Yeah, some of the true stories I tell, I make them up. But that one, every teacher I had, I got preferential, and they didn't call it preferential treatment, but they respected the fact that I've got one serious student in this room. So the manner in which you present yourself helps to elevate you to the point that people see you as what you profess to be. So it isn't all that you are waiting for somebody to figure out that they ought to honor you, they ought to respect you. Do something positive to make sure of that. And there are no teachers here that were here when, they all either passed away or something else. But I would tell you, to the last one of them passed away, I still heard from them. Still heard from them. They'd asked me to come and speak at their class. Now I wasn't at the top of my class academically. I wasn't Phi Beta Kappa, none of that. I've never been in any organization that I was the best in that organization, but I've been the best for that organization in every organization I've ever been in. I played basketball, football, and baseball. I was never the best player in either of those teams, but I was the best player for that team in each case. And you know why? Because I respected everybody on the team, and it showed they knew it. And because of that, the team was better. And when you create an environment in which it is better, everybody is better off. Everybody's better off. So it's not a one-side proposition. It is to your advantage to create an environment in which everybody is honored and respected. And next thing you know, you begin to like each other. And then like Tom and me, you'll begin to love each other. And we've known each other for a long, long time, but we love each other. And we're unabashed about that. Tom wasn't invited here, he broke in, but he's my friend. What I'm saying to you, young people, is it's a two-way thing, it's a two-way proposition. Don't wait for somebody to start respecting you, don't wait for that. That may not ever happen. Learn how to generate respect. Learn how to create an environment in which everybody is respected. and you'll profit from that. Everybody else in that will profit. And you'll be surprised how many people will tag team with you when that starts to happen. Now, I'm not watching the clock, but I think we've passed the time. That clock isn't right. That's my bedtime on that clock.
I didn't even see the clock.
Well, this is an hour past. But
Thank you very much, Mr. Flood. Thank you.
Thank you.
So with that, that was truly inspiring. Thank you very much for that conversation. I now open it up to questions from the audience. I think that you generated a lot of questions for me, and I look forward to hearing what others have to ask too. We have a microphone here in the aisle, so feel free to come up to the microphone. And there is a microphone up here for folks who are in the upper level, kind of right in that corner there. So feel free to come up and ask your questions. I might start with one, if that's okay. There are many, but the issues that you were talking about are clearly still very relevant in North Carolina and nationally as well. So what are your thoughts on the current state of the Leandro case here in North Carolina?
Thank you. Keep in mind, this is my thoughts, not research, not documentation. When Leandro was created as an entity, we didn't have an opportunity to educate people about the criticality of it. And not having had that opportunity, because the Department of Public Instruction didn't create land, it was created by the court, which is proper in the General Assembly. So we were asking people to do something that they didn't know why they were being asked to do it. Now, as wise as our General Assembly is, it looks at distribution of resources more than it looks at any other one thing. And in their mind, you got to have a rainy day fund over here, a couple of $100,000, and you got to have the highway fund over here that's an inordinate amount of money. And by the way, we got to have schools. By the way, we got to have schools. Now, that's not to indict anybody. I'm just telling you what I know, because I've been at this now for 70 years, and I've seen it just that way in all these 70 years. So all of a sudden, the court says something that we already knew, and that is that we are not having an equal funding opportunity for several schools. Of course, 5 school districts filed the suit, but you could have had 15, you could have had 20, you could have had any number. Here's why you don't have an equitable distribution, because we have equality. The greatest deterrent I know to equity is equality. I don't know a greater deterrent, because equality is you give each person the same thing, notwithstanding what they may need, give them the same thing. We say, oh, you gave everybody $1. So they'd gotten away from what I told you earlier, when black schools were getting $5 and white schools $5 too. But what we're doing now is we're giving everybody the same thing, a per pupil allocation. Now, let me go back to Swan Quarter, since you've asked about that Hyde County. If you lived in Hyde County and you wanted to go, let's say, to a good movie, at that time you had to drive to Williamston to go to a movie. You wouldn't have had a theater in Swansboro, now Englehart, now Mattamuskeet at that time. So if I'm a teacher and I want to go to movies, I'm going to go somewhere and teach where I can drive an hour and a half. When I was principal in Bethel, if I wanted a certain kind of light bulb, I had to come to Raleigh to get it. Nowhere that I could get a certain kind. I could get, a little screw-in bulb. I want a fluorescent. Equity then was not giving me the same thing you give everybody else. Equity would have been looking at my circumstance and funding me according to the circumstance. So without a full understanding, the General Assembly didn't see then, doesn't see now, the criticality of differentiating in how you fund schools. And not only that, but an allocation of an amount of money for this year is not going to change anything. There has to be a base that you understand so that we ask people to make a 5-year plan and you're going to fund me for 1 year. How do I project 5 years with my funding is for 1 year? No. So if you had a policy that lets me know I can think 5 years ahead, and 5 years from now, this is something that I'll have access to, and I can begin to plan for it. Now, what I think about it, it's going to happen. It's going to happen, not soon enough. It's going to happen. I know there are a lot of people who differ with me. They say this is never going to happen. It's going to happen. I don't think it'll happen this year. I think it will take some dancing around before we get to it. But we're going to come to realize that that's in the best interest of the whole state. It's not just in the best interest. I grew up in Hertford County, the town of Winton, population 698. My education wasn't for Winton. My education has been for the United States of America. There are only 2 states in this country in which I haven't been to help people learn a different way to live. So if they just educated me for Winton, that'd been really easy. They didn't educate me for me. They educated me for a service I could render. And if we ever understand that, we would see it's just inappropriate to undereducate anybody because we're losing that clientele who could make things better for all of us. And I'm thankful to have had a family who knew that, That was the difference in my fate and somebody else's, is I never heard a negative expression in my house. I never heard, if I started saying, Mom, I don't have, she said, look what you do have. Take that and make it work. So that was the culture in which we survived prior to having some relief in the way of funding. But when Leander is fulfilled, and it can't be in one fell swoop, I know that, but give some evidence that you're headed in that direction. I'm optimistic, believe that we are going to get some evidence in the next session, because I think people know now it's not going away. We're not going to stop nagging. We're not going to stop pushing until it happens. And people now are running for office who believe, if for no other reason, they're going to keep nagging us to death, so we might as well go ahead and do something about it. So keep your courage up. Those of you who are going into teaching, you're going to find it better than it is right now. It's not bad now. You don't hear the good part. But it will happen. It will happen.
You made it sound so easy, like there were no difficulties. My concern is that my experience was different. How do you maintain yourself when all this hatred and bigotry is around you that you have to deal with? Now, I've seen in my lifetime, I'm only 75, how it has changed. But now I see it's coming back in the classroom. How do you maintain yourself to keep from falling in that trap of hating folks or getting into this bigotry that is confronting you if you're a teacher in the educational system?
Thank you for that question. I'll be personal about this. I'd be surprised if you've had any difficulty in your life that I haven't had. I'd be astonished. I was born into a family of 9. My father was an alumnus of the 5th grade. My father was the son of a Native American woman and a white man who never benefited her with marriage. My mother was black. My father recognized that he was better off to be black than he was to be a half-breed. But even in that circumstance, I was always taught, make it better, make it better. Now, some cases I wasn't taught how, but if that were my mission, to look forward to making it better, I spent an inordinate amount of time understanding, number one, how not to make it worse. Because when you're on the bottom of a hole, you stop digging. You stop digging. And so the first thing is to not make it worse. And the second is to not be a victim. I will not let you make me a victim. I will not do that. So in order for not let you make me a victim, I have to understand how is it I get beyond this victimization. Because I see it coming. I know. And some of the experience that I had on the circuit when we were doing this work, I couldn't even tell them in a decent group like you. Some of the names I received, I've got 2 or 3 letters that I've saved just in case my family one day want to find out, what did you really do? Because they don't know. They don't know what I did. You wouldn't go home and tell your wife, that you just got called, something that she wouldn't have appreciated you haven't been called. But the answer to your specific question is, number one, don't ever forget those things that you've been through. Don't ever forget those, because they give you the impetus to move forward. But don't ever look in the mirror and see yourself as less than. That's the second thing. When I look in the mirror, the first thing I see is a consummate educator. I see a pretty decent human being. I see a person who would not knowingly and deliberately ever do something to hurt you. And, oh, by the way, I'm black. I don't start with black. By the way, I'm black. You'll never not be black. But that is not my definition. And if I don't assign myself that definition, it's my major trait, quality, characteristic, don't bother me much what you think. I think, I'm sorry for you if you, that incapable of knowing what you're seeing, what you get. So start with self. Start with ensuring yourself that you don't ever spend one time feeling less than another human being. You're good at something I can't do. I don't know what it is. I guarantee you're good at something I need that I can't do. So always keep that in the front of your thinking. And then learn as much as you can learn about people who are different from you. Learn all you can learn about them before you draw any conclusion. And then when you shall have learned, compare what you used to think with what you now know. Until you make that comparison, you don't begin in the direction we're talking about. And then when you shall have made that comparison, be honest with yourself about it and make a declaration. Then I'm going to act on my new information. I'll make this personal reference. Again, I mentioned Gene and Gene Cosby. I can't ever go without talking about Gene. I told you I grew up in Eastern North Carolina. Gene, and I didn't know he grew up in Western North Carolina. We'd worked together 2-3 years before I knew that. Because the only prejudice that I'm aware that I've ever had was where you live. I grew up with that prejudice. I grew up believing that people in Eastern North Carolina were the finest salt of the earth. Still have a little bit of that in me, but I grew up believing that. People in the Piedmont, not so much. But in the mountains, forget it. I ain't going into the mountains. It ain't gonna happen. Because I know when you see one hillbilly, you've seen them all. That's how I grew up. I grew up because I read that. I read, Little Abner, Bunny Gould, Snuffy Smith. I grew up. I didn't consciously know that, but it was down in me. Well, Gene and I were up in Asheville one day. It was getting dark, and I said, Gene, we need to get on down the mountain. And Gene said, why we want to go back tonight? Why don't we just stay up here? I said, Gene, we don't have anywhere to stay. He said, we can stay with my folk. I almost dropped my teeth. Your folk? Because when I met Gene, he was living in Goldsboro, and I was living in Greenville, good Eastern person. He said, yeah, didn't you know I'm from Burke County? I said to myself, Seth, here's a hillbilly sitting right on my front seat. That's the moment of reckoning. You ask yourself, what am I going to believe? Am I going to believe what I learned all those years from people who are most well trusted? Or am I going to believe my own perception of my experience with this person? He is very, very different from me in every way I can think of except one, and that is he loves human beings. He loves me, and I love him. That was enough to make that determination. So the day he died, he was still my best friend. You were at the funeral, and you know that he had one person speak at his funeral, and that was me. And that was because I had the moment of cleansing not to think maybe, but to know without question that people don't have to be just like me to be all right. Now, moving from that to strategies that you must employ to ensure that you eradicate some of those things that are bringing about this hatred. I don't want to sound glib about this, but when you hear a shooting like you heard 2 or 3 days ago, listen carefully to what the person who did the shooting says. Listen carefully. This is not endorsing somebody's behavior, because I hate that as bad as you hate, and I don't even know if it's true or not. But the man, the young boy who just shot his 3 teammates, what did he say? They were messing with me. Now, you don't know what messing with me might have been. Again, that doesn't justify it. I'm telling you, if you lack the skills to deal with that, if you lack the skills to do, you don't have enough social skills to reconcile with somebody because they've done something that you see as being pejorative, then you resort to that thing I talk about all the time, and that is the recapitulation theory. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. I want you to go home and look it up. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. That is, at the very depth of our core, we resort under critical times to what was our ancestral traits. And those people that you're reacting with now are reverting back to their ancestral traits. So there's something in the fiber, even though they're trying very hard to be a decent person, but in that fiber is that still, I'm better than you. I'm more deserving than you. I'm more worthy than you. My contribution is greater than yours. Doesn't matter that they don't articulate. You're going to see that in human beings. Everybody's got to have somebody to look down on. So work in that direction. Work in trying to understand what is precipitating this stuff, not excuse it. Didn't say excuse it. Understand it. And then you know that what you have to do is get at the very core of this. And then, you know, why you find it necessary to behave this way toward me. And here's what would work better for you. It would work much better for you than last personal reference I have is I worked for a gentleman when I was 19 years old in Atlantic City, New Jersey, where I was working in an ice cream parlor. And he had the urge, every time he would tell me what you need to do, I want you to do this like a good boy. I want you to do this like a good boy. And so after I had about all that I could take, I asked him if I could speak to you privately over here. I already got it that I'm a good boy. I already got that, so I don't need to hear that anymore. Would you be willing just to call me Dudley? And do you know he didn't know my name? And I'd been working there 2 or 3 weeks. Didn't know my name. I'm a good boy. So the intervention factor is find an acceptable way to intervene when you're feeling that you're being disrespected, an acceptable way. I didn't tell him what I was feeling inside. I was feeling inside, you got 2 or 3 more times to do this, you're gonna get your pants dirty, you know. But that ain't what I said. What I said, and he would have. I mean, I've always been as civilized as I am now. And I was 19, yeah, he'd got his pants dirty. But the whole thing was find a way to have that discourse that lessens the tension, that lessens the proclivity for somebody to think, I got to get you back, I got to put you down and all that. And you can do that. I can tell you wouldn't be here if you couldn't. You would have shown your capability. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to ask you a question about something you said earlier, and I did have to write it down to remember, but you referred briefly to current trends in education of cutting things out and talked about when you were doing the work in Hyde County, when people were trying to do that, you responded with, is that educationally sound? And so my question is, how can we bring that kind of dialogue and turn down the heat in some of the current debates about education and removing things from education?
If we had the audience, that's the real challenge, is to get the audience that needs to hear that. Because in this room, we have people who already know that. You made this open to everybody, but who came? Well, people who already know that. People who already believe what I'm saying are here. Now, that's not to assume that that aren't some good people who didn't come. I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying our difficulty is getting an audience with people who really need to hear that. Now, we work really hard at doing that. I think we're getting a little closer to it. I know that the center is getting closer to it. Not necessarily me, but again, take it apart from them. Take it apart. And when I've had a chance to be able to talk to some of them about this or that or the other, and they asked me about critical race theory, I said, let me help you understand what a theory is. When you do a doctoral program, you're required to write, and you start with a null hypothesis, and you process that to see if you can prove or disprove that hypothesis. Once you have done that, you develop a theory around that hypothesis. Now, if you're real smart and sensitive, you might be careful what you name it, but that notwithstanding. So it doesn't mean this is the only way in the world to do anything. It means this is one of the ways we ought to take into consideration. I don't know for sure that E equals MC squared. I don't know that for sure, but I haven't heard anybody argue about it. I haven't heard anybody say we ought not to teach it. Do you know? And so when people are given the understanding of why we do what we do. Now, I taught history for a while, and I would have prayed for anything that would help me as ancillary material. I don't care whose theory it was or what it said, but I wouldn't have been indoctrinating anybody. That's not indoctrination. I taught Mein Kampf. I didn't see a Nazi come out of my room. I taught Fall of the Bastille. I didn't see anybody trying to model the Spanish Revolution. I taught French Revolution. I didn't see any Napoleon come. So it's interesting to me that somebody is fearful that if I teach you about the history of people of color, that I'm teaching you how to hate white people. That's amazing to me that you would give me that little credit. But that's where we are. And so what we have to do is we have to uncover that. We have to uncover it. I almost got to name it what it is. It is avoidance. We fear anything we don't understand. We fear. I used to catch snakes. All y'all scared of snakes because you don't understand them. I understood snakes. I lived right on the riverbank. I don't remember a day a snake didn't crawl across my yard. So at some point you got tired of that same snake crawling. You caught him, sold him to somebody who wanted to buy a snake. But I don't fear them because I understand them. But by the way, whenever I'd go to catch snakes, somebody would ask me, can I go with you? I say, you afraid of snake? No. Well, you can't go with me. You ain't got sense enough to be afraid of snake. Well, the snake is not your friend. You see, the whole thing is knowledge, understanding. And when you understand enough about it that you can share it with somebody else in a non-assertive way, a non-aggressive way, and a non-adversarial way, we got a lot better chance. So every chance I get to have a listening audience, I talk about those things so that they can understand it's not good or bad, it's part of our history. And we're teaching other people's history. We're teaching Italian history. We're teaching French history. We're teaching Latin. We need to teach all of it because we're better off when we know it. So it's safe, but be sure you know how to present it. Sure you know how to present it.
So, in your conversation on decision-making and influencing that decision-making process, you focused on changing perspectives and fostering empathy, and with humility, educating the people who were making the decisions as well. And I was just wondering, do you see, with like the current climate today and how decisions are made, do you see the educator today as someone who is situated in a position to influence decision making in that way?
it's almost never that one person will be in that position. It's almost always that we have to join hands and as a mass influence decision making. So if we were to organize ourselves strategically enough, there are enough educators in this state get anything they want, but we're divided. We're divided in so many levels. And so I've gone in the last 2 weeks to different meetings of people who ought to be working together. We went one day to the school board's meeting. We went one day to the Department of Public Instruction meeting. Sometime before that, went to the superintendent's meeting. Now, I know there's reason for you to get together as an indigenous group, but you ought to be on the same page. You ought to be saying, ultimately, if it is a good thing, we ought to all be saying that. And there are more of us than there are of them, whoever that them is. So if we were to speak with one voice, you'd get most of what you want. But as an individual, it's very difficult unless you're in a prime position and you're fortunate enough. Gene and I were in a good position when we worked because ultimately we had no power and you knew it, but we had access to power. My signature could have caused you not to get your federal money. And I never ever made that statement. Never, but you knew it. And you knew I did not want that to happen. I didn't want that. So as far as you're going to have power, that was the power of the state handed down to me through the job I held. But as a body of believers, when we believe the same thing, if we would get together and all of us defend that, of all of us understand that well enough to pass it on to people who will understand it less well, we would have a much better chance. But what people do when they want to conquer is they divide. Divide and conquer is the oldest strategy in the world. And that's what society has done to us, is divided and conquered. So let's just pull together. We need all of you to be thinking similarly to what is good. Thank you.
Yes. Dr. Flood, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and the overarching message that we have to be relentless in our pursuit of equity, that we must maintain our integrity in that pursuit, and we just have to work together. And so I encourage you all to work together, be relentless, and maintain your integrity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Flood. Thank you, Dr. Bentley-Edwards. This was truly an inspiring night. Really appreciate your being here. Thank you all for coming as well. We have a number of recent publications that I want to highlight that are highly related to the work that was discussed here tonight. These are all available on the Center for Child and Family Policy website for you to read. Dr. Sunny Ladd has a recent policy memo, How Charter Schools Undermine Good Education Policymaking. Dr. Keisha Daniels has a recent policy brief identifying barriers to recruiting and retaining a diverse teacher workforce, and her latest, Teacher Workforce Diversity, What It Matters for Student Outcomes. So I encourage you to take a look at those. We also hope to continue to engage with all of you on these and other critical issues. So in that spirit, we invite you to attend our next Sulzberger Distinguished Lecture, which is February 21st. It will feature Dr. Velma McBride Murray, who's University Professor at Vanderbilt University. She will discuss her work on the Strong African American Families Program and the Pathways for African American Success Program, and how those have promoted positive youth development. So thank you again for attending tonight. We hope you'll join us now for a reception right upstairs. And one more round of applause for Dr. Flood and Dr. Bentley-Edwards.